Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Scoreboard podcast. I'm your host, Rivka Boord of Jets X Factor, the home of the best New York Jets content on the internet. We'll cover all things Jets here and try to bring in the numbers and film in addition to just everything that you'll hear anywhere. So let's get right into it. Some of the things that are most on Jets fans' minds nowadays. The first thing is the Jets and the Hackett, the bombshell athletic report that came out last week. And my first reaction to it was like, whoa, what is going on over here? This is crazy. But when you think about it, as has been pointed out by some other people, we knew most of this. You could tell from the outside that this was going on. It's hard to see it in black and white, but at the same time, it's not shocking in any way. For example, let's go through some of the things that it said in this article. Some of it was just pure conjecture, speculation, or just editorializing. But let's say saying that Rodgers isn't the assistant GM, Joe Douglas is the assistant GM. I mean, that seemed kind of obvious from the time that Rodgers had his so-called demand list, which was more of a wish list, it seems like. And yes, Rodgers did get for a lot of what he asked for, and no, none of it worked out. You have to wonder, did Joe Douglas, would he have made these moves, especially Dalvin Cook, if not for Rodgers asking for it? And let's say signing Lazard. So Lazard came in before Rodgers, but the move was made to bring in Rodgers. The signing Hackett was just to lure Rodgers to New York. They signed, brought in Randall Cobb, brought in Tim Boyle, brought in Billy Turner. Yes, a lot of these were Rodgers-based moves. Some of the stuff about Hackett was pretty bad, though. For example, talking about the offensive line, how just Hackett showed a complete lack of urgency about it. I don't know, Robert Saleh seemed pretty urgent about it in his Hard Knocks speech. Now, that could have been made for the benefit of the cameras, but still, you could tell he was very frustrated with the offensive line, but Hackett just seemed to think that everything was going to go away. That's an issue. Then also, the fact that a coach would say that he's never seen a team watch less practice tape in training camp than the Jets did with Hackett. Yikes. That's some really bad stuff about Hackett. And then talking about how Hackett lacked attention to detail and he wouldn't meet with a lot of his offensive staff until last minute game prep. This stuff screams same old Jets. It's the same stuff. It's like, Jets complete incompetence. Like, we're not talking about, the coach just didn't work out, it was bad. This is elementary stuff that any coach should be doing. And really, on a different team, if the Jets weren't hamstrung by Rodgers, this would get Hackett fired. The fact that Hackett would not adjust and give Dwayne Brown help for Micah Parsons, and that, I mean, we already knew that Hackett said he was surprised by how good Parsons was. I mean, what has he been watching exactly? And then, so about Hackett, let's say, hopefully the Jets can find someone else to be the play caller, even if Hackett is still the play caller in name, and hopefully Rodgers can take over the play calling and do a good job because it just seems like Hackett for the second consecutive year was a total dumpster fire. But then some of the stuff about Saleh seemed a little bit bitter. Like, you wonder how much of it is really true. Yes, Saleh seemed very, woe is me when Rodgers got injured, and he kind of seemed to give up on the season to a certain extent. But there is no way that he downloaded these statistics and was sharing them with everyone. Yes, he saw the numbers, okay, and he knew that the deck was stacked against him once Rodgers went down. But I doubt he was actually walking around the whole time saying, using it as an excuse. That being said, the fact that the Jets chose to only go for 7 wins once Rodgers went down and their goal was 7 wins, it showed on the field and it showed with the decisions they made. Some things they waited a long time to do. The fact that they did nothing at the trade deadline when they were still in contention. They were resting on their laurels and decided to punt on the 2023 season, which was very frustrating for fans and definitely seemed to be a collaboration between Saleh and Douglas. As far as what happened with Saleh and Zach Wilson, I don't believe that, the stuff about Wilson not wanting to play was very embarrassing for the Jets. But the fact that Saleh threatened to take his staffers' phones, I don't really believe that. Still, the fact that he was upset about a leak, anyone would be very upset about a leak from within an organization. You don't know who talked to The Athletic, but the fact that, there was some reporting or speculation that Tim Boyle was the one speaking in season because the Jets cut him. And now there's some speculation that Taylor Embry or even Rex Hogan were the ones who were speaking, or gave some of these leaks because the Jets got rid of both of them. The thing is, Rex Hogan wasn't going to be a scapegoat anyway. If the Jets weren't firing Douglas, they were going to fire someone in player personnel, and Hogan seems to be one of the heads of the Jets player personnel. So honestly, it's better than not to just say goodbye to Hogan, because the Jets scouting of personnel, especially in the pros, has been atrocious. I don't necessarily think it had anything to do with being the leaker. But this report is pretty terrible, and says some pretty bad things about the Jets organization. But we saw the dysfunction from the outside. The fact that you're actually being told that it was happening. Yeah, it's bad that people were willing to leak it, but most of it was pretty obvious, as it is. The bigger issue is that nothing is going to be done to change. If Woody Johnson knew this was going on, or if the Jets internally knew this was going on, changes should have been made anyway. Nothing to do with whether the report came out to the public. The fact that Woody decided to just return solid, Douglas let everyone come back, Hackett. They didn't even fire like Keith Carter or any of the key positions that messed up. They're running it all back. They even kept Todd Downing and Rob Calabrese. Some of the guys who have taken the most blame for some of the situations. And now they're doubling down on Titans retreads. So you have to hope that the spirit of nepotism that flows through the Jets organization can somehow be banded up, be patched up by Rodgers, and he can compensate for it. But this definitely looks really bad for the Jets heading into 2024, and it was definitely a very demoralizing report. Now, another topic that are on people's minds will go next to the draft. Since the Senior Bowl, we had the Senior Bowl, we had the Shrine Bowl. Personally, I don't put too much stock into any of these practices, but I know the Jets do, as they've drafted a bunch of guys who are at the Senior Bowl. Jeff Ulbrich was coaching one of the teams at the Senior Bowl. So, and we heard him say about Talisa Fuaga that he liked him. So that's something to definitely keep an eye on. It does seem pretty likely that the Jets are going to try to take a tackle in the first round, and Fuaga has been the most common buzz name around, especially with the report that Joe Douglas has an affinity for him. The thing about Fuaga is that there is some speculation that he would be a better guard than tackle, and Joe Blewett of Jets X Factor agrees with that assessment and says that he's worried about Fuaga against speed rushers. And it's not that he can't play tackle, but it's a concern. And just like Elijah Vera Tucker, where many people say, look, he was good at tackle, and the numbers seem to indicate he's a better pass blocker at tackle. But if you just watch him at tackle, he's just not the same player. The arm length is an issue. And so with Fuaga, he has also not as short as Vera Tucker, but 33-inch arms. On the shorter side, definitely doesn't have the greatest lateral movement skills. And so he could be a very good guard, but the Jets really need someone to play tackle. It's not just about getting the best offensive lineman. They really actually need someone to put in at the tackle spot. The problem is that Olu Fashanu, who's one of the other names that, is commonly linked with the Jets, Blewett did not think highly of Fashanu, has him ranked as his third tackle, but thinks he's very raw and needs a lot of work, not just in the run game. In the run game, he's outright bad. He's not just okay. He's not the greatest in that area. The Jets, if they bring in Fashanu, they're going to see a lot of the same run stuffing issues that they were seeing until now, that they saw last year. And as much as the Jets say we want pass blocking, and yes, they do, they can't fill their entire offensive line with guys who can pass block but can't run block. So they would prefer to take someone who has at least some balance of both. Now, Joe Alt is clearly the best tackle in this draft, but Alt is very likely to be off the board by the time the Jets pick, unless Tennessee somehow decides to go receiver instead of tackle. And even if that happens, the Giants, Chicago, even the Chargers could all take tackle, so Alt may be off the board. The tackle actually that Blewett has ranked second, where the buzz has completely disappeared on him, is J.C. Latham, who, is a right tackle. People are not enamored of him because of his size. But the truth is that he hasn't had the same weight issues that Mekhi Becton has. He gained the weight more intentionally, and gained it in muscle. And Blewett sees him as the next best player. He said the Ohio State game that everyone looked at, that was terrible. Sorry, it was Ohio State. I think it was Michigan. There was one game where people said that, oh, he played terribly. Blue had said he he maybe lost a couple of reps in that game, but overall he had a good game. And so Latham is, you're not really hearing his name to the Jets, but he's a player to keep an eye on because he probably will be available at number 10, and the Jets could potentially even trade down a bit and still get him. So keep an eye on him through the draft process, especially as the combine hits, see what his metrics are like, because the Jets like guys with high RAS scores, high relative athletic scores. He may not score quite as well because he's so big, but just keep an eye on him through the draft process because he might actually be an ideal pick. After the first round, the Jets don't have a second round pick. The question is, can they recoup that pick? Now, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, trade down a few spots in the first round and get back your second round pick. That's not how it works. You don't just get a second round pick for trading down a few slots. If you remember, the Jets traded up from 23 to 14 to get Elijah Vera Tucker, and they gave up 2 third-round picks. But that's, it would take that kind of like at least 6, 7, 8, 9 spots to get a second round pick. And who says that anyone's willing to trade up that much for a player they absolutely love? Yes, there are some really blue chip prospects in this draft, but there definitely aren't, unless Jaden Daniels falls and someone decides they want to pick him up. There really isn't a quarterback to trade up for there. And there also, after the top 3 receivers, doesn't seem to be any can't miss receiver that someone's going to trade up for. So unless somehow Malik Neighbors falls outside the top 10 or falls to number 10 and the Jets prefer to trade down, although I think they should just take Neighbors themselves if he's there. If Neighbors falls, maybe someone wants to pick him up. I would not say the same for Rome Odunze. If he's available, I would definitely say to trade down to anyone who wants to take him. But I just don't know if anyone's going to be willing to trade up that much to give up a third-round pick. Usually you move up a couple of slots in the draft, you give up a fourth-round pick. That's been the general trend. So I don't know where people are getting that from. The one thing that I could see is the Jets possibly trying to tag and trade Bryce Huff. I've been talking about that for a while. There were a lot of misconceptions out there with a Bryce Huff tag and trade. So first of all, whatever the tag amount is, whether it's 21 million, 23 million, depending on whether his position is defensive end or outside linebacker, if you tag and trade a guy and they work out an extension with the other team, the tag goes away. So for example, let's say the tag amount is 23 million, but then he could still sign an extension worth 16, 17 million per year with a different team, and then the 23 million disappears. That's how a tag and trade works. So that number is not final. Even the Jets themselves could tag him and then just be able to either negotiate against themselves and kind of lock him up to a deal or then trade him. Now, the bigger question is if the Jets would be able to trade him if teams actually do value him at the number that he wants, and also if they would be willing to give up a second-round pick if they're also going to have to sign him to an extension. But even if you could get a third-round pick for him, people are like, oh, just let him walk for the third-round comp pick. Well, there's 2 problems with that. First of all, the comp pick wouldn't be until 2025, and the Jets if they're going to let Huff walk, they need compensation this year because that now is when they don't have draft capital. But second of all, and more importantly, the comp pick that they would get for Huff would only be if they didn't sign an equivalent free agent to a big contract. And chances are they're going to try to sign either a tackle or a receiver. They're going to probably go after Calvin Ridley or Mike Evans. Those guys could end up having a third-round value, which would cancel out Huff's comp pick. You could check out my article that I wrote about how comp picks work, but the Jets could very well, if they let Huff test free agency, they could very, very easily end up with nothing for him, which would be one of the dumbest ways to let a homegrown free agent walk. So that, in my opinion, the Jets need to try to tag and trade Huff for whatever they can get back. If not a second-round pick, maybe they could get a third-rounder and a mid-rounder just to recoup some draft capital. If they can get back a second-rounder, then they're in play over there looking at a receiver, looking at some of the other positions people have been talking about. Quarterbacks, some of the quarterbacks may fall to the second round. If Michael Penix falls to the second round, didn't have a good Senior Bowl, but if he falls, Bo Nix, J.J. McCarthy, some of these guys that might go earlier, but also could fall like we saw last year with Will Levis. So, you never know with that if they have a second rounder. Then they have a third rounder and 2 fourth rounders. Chances are, depending on what they do in free agency, that they would look at receiver and defensive tackle there. They also have a sneaky need at edge rusher because if they do let Huff walk and Carl Lawson is a free agent, they're only going to have 4 edge defenders under contract, and they really probably would be better off not relying on Will McDonald to, raise his snap count to 50-60% of the snaps this season, even though ideally he would, because he's a first round pick, and in year 2 you want to see them become starters, especially at where he was already an older rookie. But they do need it. They like to have at least a 5 deep edge rotation, so they're probably looking edge either in free agency or in the draft if they let Huff walk. And then possibly interior offensive line, where sometimes you can find a pretty decent player in the 3rd, 4th round. The run stuffing defensive tackle, if they don't sign one, they'll probably look for one. They might sign a safety in the later rounds unless they like Jarek Bernard-Converse. Running back is less likely because they need someone more proven. They already took Izzy Abanikanda last year. They need someone who's a little more proven, more likely to go free agency. But it'll be interesting to keep an eye on some of the later round picks that might be available. And that leads into also what are the Jets going to do in free agency? So the Jets are in a bad position in terms of the amount of needs they have versus the amount of money they have, because realistically speaking, right now they have no tackles under contract. They almost certainly should release Laken Tomlinson, not least because they can definitely sign a better replacement for cheaper, but also because he has an $18.8 million cap hit, which is not realistic for the Jets to carry, especially for a player who's played as poorly as he has. But then they also need a second receiver, and then people are kind of acting like, oh, the Jets, if they sign a second receiver, they're good, they don't need to sign anyone else. They really need also someone who can at least challenge Lazard for the number 3 receiver spot, since Lazard played like a number 5 this past year. Yes, you can hope that he'll return to his production level if with Rodgers back, but the thing is, the truth is, Lazard was always best off as a low volume target. That's where he did his best. He was very inefficient in his last year with Green Bay when he was forced to be their number 2 receiver. And so the Jets are best off signing another guy, maybe not an outright number 3, but at least a guy who's number 3, number 4. Personally, I prefer like a Noah Brown type if they can get him on a relatively cheap deal. If they signed McCole Hardman last year, Noah Brown is better than McCole Hardman, and his projected contract isn't that high. The Jets, again, they need an edge defender. Personally, I like Andrew Van Ginkel a lot. I've always found him a thorn in the Jets' side when he was with Miami. So I would personally prefer to sign him. I feel like he's a rotational guy, but still, he could very much replace at least some of Huff's production. He's a better run defender. Obviously, he's not the pass rusher that Huff is, but he can overall be a more well-rounded piece in the Jets' rotation, because they really only like to use Huff in obvious passing situations, even last year when he played more snaps, whereas Van Ginkel can play in both. There are a few cheap free agent defensive tackles, run stuffers that could be available. Shelby Harris got a deal, $3.5 million from Cleveland. I like Maurice Hurst, Cleveland's backup defensive tackle, although he has injury history, but he played very well this past year, albeit in Cleveland's defense, so you have questions about that. Michael went into Jonathan Harris on Denver and Armon Watts on Pittsburgh, how they could be cost-effective options. There are some other options out there who could replace Al Woods' role if the Jets do bring back Quentin Jefferson. Then there's at safety, I want them to just bring back Chuck Clark and Ashton Davis, maybe sign another free safety unless they're comfortable with Jarek Bernard-Converse, which we'll see about. I prefer to see someone at least who can somewhat challenge Tony Adams and not make him the automatic starter, although he was decent. Backup quarterback is another need. People keep talking about Jacoby Brissett and Gardner Minshew. I don't see any way that the Jets are going to pay $10 million for a backup quarterback. I see them more going the Ryan Tannehill or Tyrod Taylor route, which is going to be more like $4, $5, $6 million a year. Even though they're older, these are veterans who can step in if you need them. Yes, you're not going to win a Super Bowl with them, but if you need them for a few games, they can do a decent job. They can fill in. Tyrod Taylor in particular did a very decent job with the Giants in a bad situation. So I see them looking more in that area. And then backup running back, there are many options. Michael Nania wrote an article explaining about the Jets' different options at running back. Personally, I favor Antonio Gibson from Washington, because the way I see it is that they should be using Breece Hall as their 2-down back, definitely out there all the time. What you really want is a guy who can pass block and can catch out of the backfield. And Gibson has a good history of he now has a 3-year history of very solid production out of the backfield. as a receiver. And he also has 2 years where he got good PFF run blocking grades, pass blocking grades. Now, I know PFF is not the be all and end all. If you've ever seen any of my writing, I've tried to drop PFF grades as much as I can, but sometimes there really aren't many other statistics that can come in place of the grade, and I didn't have time to watch film on every single one of these players. So we're going to go with Gibson. Gibson also, as a third down back, likely can pass block. If Izzy Abanikanda can't, the Jets cannot rely on him to be their second back. So I like Antonio Gibson in that area. But I wouldn't, look, I'm not a huge fan of A.J. Dillon, but I'd be okay if they signed him. I just want someone who has some track record of success rather than of, really being on the downside of their career. I would take Gus Edwards. Some of the other names are going to be more get starter caliber contracts. But with a depressed running back market, if you could get a guy for $2-3 million and that fits that mold of being able to block and being able to catch, then I would go with that kind of guy. So that's it for really free agency. There were a couple of other questions I just wanted to address here. So first of all, I mentioned Will McDonald. The question really is, the minute the Jets drafted Will McDonald, they really drafted him to be a Huff replacement, but to be an every down player. They saw that he has more potential in the run game, which he does. In college, they put him at 3-tech a lot, and he still wasn't completely manhandled at 240 pounds. So he's not good in the run game, but he definitely has more potential there than Huff does. The biggest issue is that the Jets literally had a guy who was the top pass rusher in terms of efficiency in the league, and he was able to maintain that level even playing 40% of the snaps. Now, he still didn't play 60% of the snaps like the Jets, let's say Jermaine Johnson played, so you can't say in a full-time starter's load that he would be the same. We also saw Huff really taper off towards the end of the season much more, which could mean that he struggled in the increased role to an extent. But still, you can't just let that guy go and expect that Will McDonald will be able to be have the same level of efficiency, no matter how much potential McDonald has. And the one thing that I think McDonald has that Huff didn't is that ability to convert sacks into forced fumbles. He forced a bunch of fumbles in college. He has long arms. He has a long reach. Huff has short arms, which actually makes it that much more impressive that he got the number of sacks that he did. But still, a lot of his sacks were more coverage sacks than immediately getting off and getting to the quarterback. He kind of had to come around and reach last minute. So McDonald definitely has the potential to be that kind of a disruptive pass rusher, but you can't live off that potential. Yes, as a rookie, he showed some flashes as a pass rusher, especially as the season went on, but he got, like, the whole season, he had a very limited number of pass rush snaps. So relying on McDonald to replace that role is very risky. But then again, they came into this season. I'm assuming the Jets did not intend from the beginning of the season to give Jermaine Johnson a 66% snap share, and that it happened that way more because Carl Lawson just completely fell off a cliff, and so they ended up adjusting it. Whereas Lawson last year played like over 55% of the snaps. So in 2022. So then in 2023, they ended up increasing Jermaine Johnson's workload, like doubling it, even though they didn't have evidence necessarily that he would become the pass rusher that he did. Still, even Johnson played very well, and don't get me wrong, I'm a very big Jermaine Johnson fan at this point. I never thought he would be as good as he was in his second year. Still, Johnson is not the kind of winner just quick winner that Huff is. He's not the kind of disruptor that Huff is. Johnson also has those, the strength and the ability to be, we saw him break up passes. We saw him with an interception. We saw him really be a disruptor, but he's not the same kind of snap in, snap out force that's going to require a double team. And so the Jets really would be relying on McDonald to be the pin your ears back type of pass rusher. And the question is just if he's learned to use his hands well enough to do that. Huff really had an inside-outside moves. He really knew how to set up defenders. McDonald really has to get better in his hand placement and being able to swipe away hands or chop at them or come with a second move when players get their hands on him. And it's risky, and the Jets run so heavily dependent on their defensive line. It's a big question whether or not McDonald can become that kind of player in year two. You're setting a very, very, very high bar for him. And that's why I would prefer the Jets to bring Huff back, but I just don't think it's going to happen. And so that's just one other thing I wanted to discuss because the Huff question is constantly on people's minds. Anyway, I think that's enough for me for my first podcast episode. Please remember to like and subscribe and share with your friends, and we'll be back for another episode of the Scoreboard podcast. I'm your host, Rivka Boord. Thank you so much for listening.